Thank you very much for your invitation, Cassia, and to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak at this very important symposium, which raises quite a number of issues about dealing with sensitive collections such as the ancestral human remains that were acquired in the most troubling and disturbing circumstances by Herman Klatsch during his Australian tour of 1904. 1907. I'm going to try and talk about two things. This brief talk will kind of fall into two parts. The first I want to talk about the scientific context of Herman Klatsch's anthropological research, and then briefly talk about its influence over time. The scientific context is what I begin by talking about. We talk today about us being in the age of the Anthropocene. And when we talk about Anthropocene, what we're recognizing by that concept is the way in which, certainly since the late 18th century, we have managed to intervene within and change the various systems by which this planet works, its physical systems, and also importantly, the myriad biological systems sustaining Earth upon life, upon Earth. I suppose there's something of an irony in the fact that the Anthropocene, as we now understand it, we've been able to understand it by virtue of those very forces, because if we look at the scientific interests that developed during the second half of the 19th century in particular, it centers increasingly on the evolution of humankind. And it does so in large part because of the Anthropocene leading to rapid industrialization throughout parts of the world, Europe obviously in particular, North America as well, resulting in geological investigations, resulting in mining, which also bring to light increasingly fossil evidence of the long history, the deep history of humanity on Earth. And of course, one of the great sort of milestones in the development of this history in the 19th century is the discovery in the Neander Valley in 1857 of the remains of a hominid specimen, commonly known as Neanderthal, which predates the emergence of, or is at the time thought to predate the emergence of archaic Homo sapiens. Now, this is very important to our story and certainly to understanding Klatsch's science, because what we find is that Thomas Henry Huxley, in his analysis of the Neanderthaler skull discovered in the late 1850s, sees in his own mind clear morphological similarities between that skull and skulls of old people, of Australian Indigenous ancestors, which have been taken from burial places and by this time are held in museums. In this particular case, the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. And what Huxley argues is that in effect, there are remarkable morphological similarities between Homo neanderthalensis, as it's described, and the skulls of Australian First Peoples. And it sets up what is to be a very pernicious and ultimately erroneous scientific belief that when we're looking at, when Aboriginal people are looked at in the late 19th century, there is this strong belief that because of these supposed morphological similarities, they are in effect closer to Neanderthal in terms of human evolution than any other living peoples on Earth. In other words, what Huxley and other scientists of the 1860s, 1870s believe is that what we're seeing, by virtue of their supposed evil isolation within the Australian continent, what we're seeing is people who have actually become frozen in time, who haven't progressed, as it were. They have not evolved either biologically or culturally to the level that one finds within Europe. And this is sort of seen as an intriguing scientific area of study. And it's one that increasingly becomes of interest as more and more fossils are found. There is the fossils which are found in the Neanderthal cave, the Neanderholer. And this is an illustration from about 1857 to 1860. The Cro-Magnon discoveries of the 1868, the Spy Cave discoveries of 1886. All of this is important background, to which we can add the discoveries by Eugène Dubois, a Dutch medical officer in Indonesia in 1891, 1892, of the fossilized remains of a hominid who comes to be known as, at the time, Anthropopithecus erectus, or Pithecanthropus erectus, or as is commonly referred to, Java man. Now, all of this is the background for the scientific work of Klatsch's colleague, close friend, Otto Schoetensack, who interestingly invests his own money in his own geological researches. He's a fairly wealthy man, an industrialist who resigns from his chosen profession by virtue of ill health, and reinvents himself in an academic career, eventually habilitating to the University of Heidelberg in 1904. Now, Schoetensack is intrigued by this history of human evolution, all the more so because of workmen who he himself has employed find in a quarry near Mauer, near Heidelberg, the underjaw of a hominid who becomes known as a Heidelberg man, Homo heidelbergensis. And it's this that leads to a very strong and interesting conversation about the importance of these remains in the course of human evolution, an interest that Schoetensack will share with his close friend and colleague, Hermann Klatsch. And a very important article that is written, inspired in key respects by the researchers of Hermann Klatsch in 1901, by Otto Schoetensack, is on the significance, the importance of the form of the Australian in the history of humanity. And Bedeutung Australiens für die Herrenbildung des Menschen aus einer niederen Form, for the early, for understanding, as it were, the course of human evolution. So the question which Otto Schoetensack puts to himself, and one which is shared by Hermann Klatsch at this time, is the question of whether the extent to which a colonization of the Americas from Oceania can be assumed, in addition to that from Asia and the Bering Strait. This may be, he argues, unclear to understand, but it seems to be, in his mind, that there is quite clearly similarities between Neanderthal mankind, as he describes it, and the primitive American variety. And he believes that these similarities can be explained by the fact that all of them originated in Australia. So the critical importance of the scientific work of Klatsch is in the light of this question. Is it the case that early Australians, that Australians are in fact the closest living representatives of a form of humanity which is in effect close to the emergence of humanity from some kind of pithecoid ape-like form? This is the crucial question that Schoetensack and Klatsch discuss amongst themselves. And ultimately, it's one of the reasons, probably the prime reason why it is that Klatsch goes to Australia to gain morphological insight into the remains of Indigenous Australians with a view to settling this question. Is it the case that Australia is of profound importance for the development of humanity from a lower form? And he brings together a wealth of evidence, not only morphological evidence, but suggestions about the ways that Indigenous culture exists, the forms of Indigenous behavior, the forms of Indigenous technology, all of which Schoetensack suggests, and Clatch, along with him, tends to agree, is pointing towards some sort of very, very close relationship between Indigenous Australians and the emergence of humanity. Since all comparative osteological studies of human varieties are still in their infancy, Schoetensack argues, it will be necessary to re-examine the skeletons of Australians from a point of view, a task which Professor Clatch is currently occupied. Clatch himself points out, and this is a diagram which is an attempt to explain the spread of human races and apes according to Clatch. And what we can see here is his belief in the center that there is, as it were, an emergent form, what he calls a Propithecanthopi. And as you look at this diagram, you can see that it spreads the migration of the higher primates and humanity out into various different parts of the world. And if you look at the diagram, you can see how it is that the Australians and the Tasmanians are centered closest, as it were, to the development of this early ancestor. And that's the scientific background that we find that Clatch goes to Australia to seek to resolve. Now, there's no real time there to talk in great detail about the development of his thinking as he goes about securing remains and measuring them as he travels around Australia. But it's quite clear that he comes to the conclusion after his Australian tour that he considers the Australians, and I quote Clatch on this, the Australians who were displaced from the centre of dispersal to the present-day Austral continent to be one of the oldest branches that completely isolated itself. So it's one of the similarity with the skeletons of the Australians, and probably also allows the conclusion that Arenac people, the people of the Arenac age, of the ancient Stone Age in Europe, had likewise similar behavioral characteristics. So this is the kind of picture that Clatch builds up. Now, briefly to turn to the social influence of Clatch, while quite obviously making this close association has itself profound and pernicious consequences for many years to come. One could argue, in effect, that the consequences of this conclusion by European science still resonates today. It still impacts upon the lives of Indigenous peoples in more subtle ways than it did once upon a time. If Clatch himself was a consummate user of the media when he was in Australia, if we look at Australian newspapers, we can find reportage of his travels through Australia between 1904 and 1907. There are probably close to 150 at least, possibly more, references to Clatch in Australian newspapers of the time, which clearly show a growing interest in his travels and his scientific research when he is in Australia. The popular influence of his work, we can see three main influences. The first is to put into place within the popular imagination of Australia at this time the idea that First Nation peoples in Australia are, scientifically speaking, a missing link, that somehow their position is one of where they are frozen in time. They exist at evolutionary ground zero, as it were. They are essentially peoples who have not progressed in terms of their biology, their intellect, or indeed their culture, further from that of the higher of a transitional form from the higher primates to hominids. And this, of course, is an extremely profound and disturbing idea when we look back on it today. Again, it's difficult to deal with some of this material. It is quite disturbing, as Hilary has said. I've been doing this work for well over 30 years, as Hilary mentioned. One thing that I've always asked elders that I've worked with over the years is how one should deal with this kind of imagery, how one should deal with these kind of texts. And the answer I'm repeatedly given is that the truth must be told. No matter how painful it may well be, it has to be known. It has to be out there. We have to basically expose this history in the cause of truth-telling if we are to achieve anything like true reconciliation in Australia today. And so what we get is this kind of cartoonish representation of Indigenous peoples arguing on the basis of kind of very popularized view of Clouch's morphological interests, particularly in this case of a man who was found at this point by Clouch in the jail, Fanny Bay Jail in Darwin, to have extraordinary ability with the ability to move his feet. That this somehow in this one individual constituted evidence that of Aboriginal people's proximity to higher primates, the so-called alleged missing link. Distressing stuff, but and one can well imagine its overall popular impact at the time. The second, and again, a profoundly influential consequence of Clouch's publicity of his work is the belief that Aboriginal children will only reach a certain level of education. Clouch argues strongly that because of their place within evolutionary history, there is not much point in educating Aboriginal people past the age of possibly 10 or 11, because after that, as he sort of says, crudely, biology will win out and they won't learn anything else. So in a sense, the emphasis that missionaries place on education is probably ill-placed. It's misguided, and what's needed is a more scientific view of the importance of education for Aboriginal people, which will tailor them to basically work as domestics or stock people within the Australian cattle industry. There's no point in giving them any further education because it's a waste. Their brains will just simply not be able to assimilate and retain the information that they are given in schools. So this is our second way in which it has a profound influence upon thinking of the time. The third, and probably in many respects the most lasting, is that Clouch argues that by virtue of the way that human evolution and migration and colonization of Earth by human beings goes, it's possible to show that in evolutionary terms, somewhat paradoxically, Aboriginal people and Europeans, a Caucasian type as it's known, are closer to each other than any other branch of human types. With the result being that what Clouch gives is evidence for what develops in earlier 20th century Australia as a theory that the best way to deal with the Aboriginal problem, as it's always regarded, it's seen that ultimately there's a problem. There's much that could be said about this. Suffice it to say that what Clouch gives is evidence which is almost the basis, as it were, for the development of a theory of assimilation within Australia. The idea that you can breed Aboriginal people into the general population, and as this illustration from the A.O. Neville, Protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, his book of 1847 shows, it is possible, so it is argued at the time, that in the course of several generations, one can, and I use the term, distressing term, breed out the colour, as it were, that one can basically absorb the Aboriginal race within the general settler population, with the result being that there will be a complete, as it were, erasure of Aboriginal people, their culture and their beliefs, in all but the most superficial ways over time. So as one can see, there is much to be gained, I think, from looking at the scientific work, but also the social influence of that scientific work of Herman Clatch over time. And I think it's important to really study this in some detail. Now, it's easy, I suppose, to get outraged about it. And there have been times over my career, I guess, where, particularly when I first started doing this work, that I did get very upset and outraged about the consequences of it. But it seems to me that while we are in the position now where we can obviously face the moral questions, the ethical questions that arise from the fact that the remains of old people, the remains of Australians, are in scientific collections and should be returned, certainly it raises very serious moral and ethical problems. It's very important, I think, to try to suspend moral judgment as much as possible to understand this past, because otherwise we risk, I think, understanding the lessons that it has to teach us. And one of the key lessons that it has to teach us is that when one talks, and Hilary mentioned resistance to repatriation before, I've encountered a lot of that over the years, particularly when I first started doing this research. The argument put forward against repatriation by scientists is generally along the lines of, well, they're still scientifically important. It's still crucial. This is evidence which is a valuable, it makes a valuable contribution to our understanding the history of humanity as a whole. In a way, quite legitimate arguments. But ultimately, when one looks very closely at the kinds of way that scientific ambitions still work in ways today, it does raise us, I think, very important questions about the degree to which, even though contemporary science may argue that in effect it is distinct from the kind of racial science which was practiced by Herman Clatch, looking back on this history, looking back on scientific ambitions, looking at the way in which remains were acquired by Herman Clatch, to my mind, it does raise serious questions about really how far are there ethical safeguards today? How far are we really working within a proper and correct ethical framework when we're dealing with collections of human remains, such as that of old people, Australian First Nations, which exist in European collections today? I think it raises some very important questions. History, I think, has some very important lessons for us to take advantage of, if we're prepared to at least try to study this difficult history in the complexity which it deserves to be studied. So I'm going to leave it there for the moment. Thank you.